In the early 1400s, Europe stood at the peak of medieval prosperity with bustling cities and thriving trade routes.
Cathedral spires pierced the heavens, while farmers cultivated every inch of fertile land to feed a growing hungry population.
The population of Europe had tripled since the year 1000, reaching nearly 80 million souls across the vast continent.
Trade networks stretched from England to Constantinople, carrying silks and spices along ancient roads established centuries before. But beneath this prosperity lurked serious problems, as overpopulation strained resources and famine had recently killed millions.
The Great Famine of 1315 had already shown how vulnerable medieval society was to sudden environmental catastrophe. No one could have imagined that something far worse was already stirring in the remote grasslands of distant Central Asia. Today, in the Tian Shan mountains near Lake Issyk-Kul, a deadly bacterium called Yersinia pestis lived quietly among wild marmot rodents. For thousands of years, this microscopic killer had remained confined to rodent populations, rarely jumping to human beings at all. Recent genetic studies have pinpointed the exact origin of the Black Death to graves near Issyk-Kul dating to 1338.
Climate changes may have disrupted rodent populations, forcing infected fleas to seek new hosts, including humans and their animals. Fleas carrying the deadly plague bacteria began hitching rides on rats aboard merchant caravans traveling along the ancient Silk Road. The vast Mongol Empire had unified trade routes across Asia, creating perfect conditions for disease to spread across vast distances. Merchants unknowingly carried death in their cargo as infected rats spread from one trading post to the next along the network. By 1346, the plague had reached the bustling trading ports along the Black Sea coast, where east met west in commerce.
The Genoese trading colony of Caffa in Crimea became ground zero for one of history's most terrifying acts of biological warfare. In 1346, the Mongol army of Janibeg laid siege to Caffa, cutting off supplies and trapping thousands within the walls. But then something unexpected happened as a mysterious illness began killing Mongol soldiers by the thousands outside Caffa's strong walls. According to Italian chronicler Gabriele de' Musi, the dying Mongols devised a horrifying plan to weaponize their own plague victims. The Mongol commanders ordered plague-infected corpses to be loaded onto massive trebuchets and hurled over the city walls of Caffa. Rotting bodies rained down upon the terrified inhabitants of Caffa, spreading disease and filling the city with horror and death. Whether this gruesome tactic actually spread the plague remains debated by historians, as infected rats likely also crossed siege lines. Regardless of the exact transmission method, panic soon gripped Caffa as citizens began dying from the terrifying, mysterious disease. Desperate Genoese merchants fled aboard their trading ships, hoping to escape the nightmare unfolding behind them in plague-ravaged Caffa. They had no idea that they carried the plague with them in the holds of their ships, bringing death to every port they would reach. In October 1347, 12 Genoese galleys arrived at the port of Messina in Sicily, carrying the seeds of catastrophe. The ships carried dying sailors covered in mysterious black swellings that oozed blood and pus in their groins and armpits all over. Horrified Sicilians drove the death ships away, but it was already too late, as the plague had begun its deadly march across all Europe. Within months, the Black Death had spread to Genoa, Venice, Pisa, and Marseille, carried by ships to every major Mediterranean seaport. The disease spread inland with terrifying speed, following trade routes and killing entire villages within weeks of first appearance.
By June 1348, the plague had reached Paris, London, and most of Western Europe, leaving mountains of corpses behind. Victims typically died within 3 to 5 days of showing symptoms, often before their families could even say goodbye to loved ones. The swollen lymph nodes called buboes would grow as large as eggs or apples, turning black before bursting with putrid infected matter. Fevers reached 106 degrees as victims vomited blood and suffered unbearable pain before death finally granted them release. The pneumonic form of plague attacked the lungs, spreading through the air with coughs and killing victims within just 24 hours. The speed and lethality of the Black Death caused the complete breakdown of social order across once prosperous European civilization. Italian chronicler Agnolo di Tura wrote that father abandoned child and wife abandoned husband as terror gripped every household now. Agnolo himself buried his 5 children with his own hands, a heartbreaking act repeated by countless parents across the dying continent. Doctors refused to see patients while priests abandoned their sacred duty to give last rites to the dying souls in their parishes. Normal burial practices became impossible as cemeteries overflowed and grave diggers themselves succumbed to the relentless deadly plague. Cities dug massive plague pits where hundreds of bodies were thrown together and covered with thin layers of dirt each passing day. Giovanni Boccaccio wrote that in Florence, huge trenches were excavated and corpses were piled in layers like merchandise in shipholds. The stench of rotting corpses filled entire cities as bodies lay abandoned in homes, streets, and fields where they had fallen dead. Some survivors lost all moral restraint, spending their remaining days in drunken revelry, convinced the world itself was finally ending. Florence alone lost over half its population of 120,000 people in just 4 months of absolute devastation everywhere. The population of Paris was halved, with an estimated 50,000 dying while the great city ground to a complete standstill forever. In Hamburg and Bremen, over 60% of the population perished, leaving behind ghost towns where thriving cities once prospered well. England lost perhaps 70% of its people, with the population falling from nearly 5 million to under 2 million inhabitants. Over 1,300 English villages were completely abandoned, never to be inhabited again as the plague erased them from existence now. Across all of Europe, between 30 and 60% of the entire population died within just 5 years of unprecedented catastrophe. Medieval physicians had absolutely no understanding of germs or bacteria and were completely helpless against the terrifying new disease. The dominant medical theory blamed miasma, or poisonous bad air, believing that foul smells from corpses and swamps caused the plague. Doctors practiced bloodletting, draining precious blood from already weakened patients in a futile attempt to balance their bodily humors. Some physicians lanced the buboes to drain the infected pus, an agonizing procedure that rarely helped and often accelerated patient death. Bizarre remedies included rubbing chopped onions on buboes and drinking mixtures of crushed emeralds hoping to cure the deadly disease. People carried flowers and strong-smelling herbs, believing sweet scents could protect them from the supposedly poisonous plague-causing air. Physicians recommended sitting between 2 enormous fires or inhaling the fumes of human feces to ward off the deadly miasma completely. Pope Clement VI sat between 2 roaring fires in his papal chambers at Avignon, one of the few measures that actually helped. The fires unknowingly killed the fleas that carried the disease, accidentally protecting the Pope through methods no one yet understood then. Venice and other Italian cities pioneered quarantine, isolating incoming ships for 40 days before allowing passengers to disembark safely. With medicine failing, many Europeans turned desperately to religion, convinced the plague was divine punishment for humanity's terrible sins. A movement called the Flagellants emerged, believing they could appease God's wrath through extreme public acts of bloody self-punishment. Groups of hundreds marched through towns stripped to the waist, whipping themselves until blood flowed freely down their lacerated backs. They performed their rituals twice daily for 33 days, 1 day for each year of Christ's life before his crucifixion then. Crowds watched in fascination and horror as the Flagellants performed their bloody rituals, singing hymns and begging God for mercy. Now, the movement spread rapidly across Germany, Poland, Flanders, and beyond, with some processions numbering over 40,000 desperate followers. Pope Clement VI condemned the Flagellants as heretics in October 1349, ordering church officials to suppress their movement. European rulers followed the Pope's lead, and within a year the flagellant movement had disappeared almost as quickly as it arose earlier. Desperate for someone to blame, many Europeans turned their fury upon Jewish communities, accusing them of deliberately causing the plague. Wild rumors spread claiming Jews had poisoned Christian wells as part of an international conspiracy to destroy all of Christendom forever. Jews were arrested and tortured until they falsely confessed to crimes they never committed, then executed by being burned alive cruelly. On February 14, 1349, the entire Jewish community of Strasbourg, nearly 2,000 people, was burned alive together. The massacre occurred before the plague had even reached Strasbourg, revealing that hatred, not plague prevention, drove these horrific attacks. By 1351, over 350 massacres had destroyed more than 200 Jewish communities across all of Europe. Pope Clement VI issued papal bulls defending the Jews, pointing out that they were also dying from the plague like everyone else. He noted that Jewish communities in areas untouched by plague were not poisoning anyone, logically disproving the conspiracy theory entirely. Despite papal protection, local authorities often participated in or permitted the massacres, allowing mobs to slaughter innocent Jewish families. Survivors fled eastward to Poland and Lithuania, where they were welcomed and would form the heart of European Jewry for centuries after. When the first devastating wave of plague finally subsided around 1352, Europe had lost nearly half of its entire population. Fields lay untended as there were simply not enough peasants alive to work the vast amounts of now available agricultural land anymore. The catastrophic labor shortage gave surviving peasants unprecedented bargaining power that would transform medieval society completely and forever now. Workers demanded and received higher wages, better working conditions, and freedoms that would have been unthinkable just years before the plague. England's ruling class attempted to fight back, passing the Statute of Laborers in 1351 to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. But the law proved nearly impossible to enforce as peasants simply moved to estates that offered better pay and working conditions elsewhere. Resentment over these oppressive labor laws contributed directly to the Great English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in later years. Though the revolt was crushed, serfdom began its slow death across Western Europe as peasants gained freedoms through economic pressure gradually. Real wages nearly doubled between 1350 and 1450, as workers became valuable assets rather than expendable servants to nobles. Women gained new opportunities as the labor shortage opened professions previously closed to them, including trades, businesses, and property ownership. The consumption of meat and dairy increased dramatically as surviving peasants could afford foods once reserved only for the wealthy classes. Europe's economy slowly transformed from feudal servitude toward a more dynamic system that would eventually give rise to modern capitalism later. The Black Death left deep psychological scars on European culture, creating an obsession with death that transformed art for generations after. The Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, became a popular artistic motif, showing skeletons leading people of all social classes to their graves. These images reminded viewers that death spared no one, not kings, not popes, not wealthy merchants, not peasants working their humble fields. Memento mori, or Remember You Must Die, became a central theme in art, literature, and philosophy as Europeans confronted their own mortality. Tomb sculptures began depicting decaying corpses eaten by worms, a stark departure from the serene effigies that had preceded the Great Plague. Giovanni Boccaccio wrote the Decameron during the plague, capturing both the horror of the epidemic and humanity's desperate search for meaning then. The trauma also shook faith in the Catholic Church, as prayers and rituals had failed to protect believers from the seemingly random death. This religious disillusionment would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation that would reshape Christianity over a century later onwards. The Black Death did not end in 1352 but returned in waves throughout the following centuries, killing millions more each time. Europe's population did not return to pre-plague levels until the 16th century, over 150 years after the initial outbreak.